Continuing the discussion, we're going to lead off into solar and the implications and opportunities with solar in the United States and around the world. I think, me personally, I just installed my solar system on my residence. I'm still dealing with some inspections, but it was a proud moment in which it makes financial sense.
Yeah.
It was an opportunity that was easy. We were able to get the permits done by another company. They were able to install it in a couple weeks. We have a government incentives that helps bring down the cost of that makes it feasible over the lifetime. And for a lot of different reasons, it was just a matter of actually getting it done. We installed an EV charging system, even though I don't have an EV car yet, but the price point were still cheaper than paying my electric bill. So that's more a discussion piece on the localized, decentralized energy production with solar. Let's talk more about the centralized version in the larger applications, or do you want to stick on the decentralized?
Let's stay on decentralized for a little bit. I mean, what's really interesting about solar, you look at when it was first introduced and the efficiencies, right? And the discussion, solar's never going to be viable. It doesn't work when the sun's not out. And what we've seen, and again, this is against a lot of the conventional wisdom that we were told, mostly by the petroleum industry and the fossil fuel industry, was that solar could never be viable as a primary source. What we're seeing now is when you have projects where they're looking for the cheapest kilowatt per hour, companies are bidding with solar, not because of subsidies, but because it is so efficient to produce with solar now. Now, the question is, how do we do solar going forward? And I think when you look at it, not just from the kilowatt per hour and the cost, but also what does it mean to have a grid that's resilient? And we saw these fires in Northern California, and we saw that PG&E's grid was totally vulnerable. There's a benefit to having decentralized solar, having solar on your house, having solar on your neighbor's house, because we live in California. There's earthquakes, there's other kinds of natural disasters, and the value of having electricity, right? If there's an earthquake, and not having your centralized system go down, that's hugely impactful. When PG&E shut off electricity because of the fires, I think it was like a $200 million economic loss in one day. And we now know, given that we've had decades really of mismanagement of critical infrastructure, that we're going to have years of new planned blackouts. And so I think the question as folks who are thinking about where do we invest, microgrids dependent on solar with on-site battery storage for residential use, but also for emergency planning, I think this should be at the top of the list.
Well, I think every commercial business should also be required to do it. Big box stores, why? And I kind of use the example, IKEA selectively decided to install solar on their roofs. But a lot of these big box stores that have massive parking lots and massive roof areas, that should be a requirement of that business because it's cheaper than the bill they pay, that they should be forced to make those investments or those negotiations because it just makes sense. If you break down the grid to every individual business generating its own on-site energy, you don't need a centralized system anymore other than the conveyance and the backup of it. You're creating all those energies on site and you're storing them on site or transferring them to neighboring sites.
Right.
So, some of those policy things are coming about when it comes to residential, all of them being required solar installation as they move forward, but some bigger steps can be made in retrofitting or adaptive reuse.
Yeah. I mean, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying we should only have solar, but if you look at the stats, San Diego, I think what I recently read was we could cover 70 to 80% of our supply in terms of what we need with solar, with rooftop solar. And so then that's just a question of return on investment, right? If you know that's a 7-year return on investment, that after 7 years, it's free electricity, right? Clean, reliable, distributed,
maintenance free.
Well, there's a little bit of maintenance, there's some maintenance, but it's way cheaper than maintaining a massive grid. And I think the other element here is that, look, we want people to have jobs, right? At the end of the day, one of the big arguments by the fossil fuel industry to prevent us from pivoting away was like, we're so dependent on this, it's going to be a job killer. Well, there's more folks working in the renewables industry in California than the fossil fuel industry. And my personal belief is that these companies, these are billion-dollar corporations. They've brought in huge amounts of money, largely because we've been subsidizing them, both actually subsidizing them in terms of tax breaks and things like that, and also because we're not charging them for their pollution. I mean, our kids are taking on that debt. But if we invest in this pivot away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, the stability that we're going to give our kids with the infrastructure for the next 40 years, that's going to lay a successful future for them. And really, there's not a lot in the middle. I mean, the carbon economy is a cliff. We know that, and the renewable economy is a job creator. So how do we lean into that? How do we incentivize that? Honestly, we're going to have to take on some fossil fuel interests to do it.
Yeah, well, and the really interesting part is that it's a skill builder, because somebody that builds a solar panel has an industrial skill that they can apply to other technology, right? When you're building inverters, or you're assembling inverters, or you're installing inverters, you're an electrician, right? That gives stability to those people that are doing residential, commercial, industrial electric jobs.
Yeah.
They might transition into that as a backup, because those industries are dependent on the market. If you have a market crash, they're easily able to step into those other industries, and that manufacturing job, they're easily able to step into computing or other industries that are very relative compared to coal mining or nuclear power. That is a one-stage position that you're always going to be in that position. So cross-training is really important, and skill building and education is critical.
Right. Yeah. I mean, nobody's outsourcing somebody who's installing solar on your roof. That's a local job, right? That's going to be there. And look, if the oil companies pay to transition and train these folks, so be it. I have not met a voter yet who's not okay with billion-dollar companies that have been getting away with decades of pollution and knowingly getting away. I mean, I think that's the other important thing to talk about, is that it's not like they didn't understand what they were doing. They knew what they were doing the whole time. I mean, there's documents now that go back that they were modeling the climate impacts 40 years ago. Yeah. And so while they were fighting solar, and our local utility still fighting the Solar Bill of Rights at the state legislature. I mean, this is something that, when I get there, I'm going to make sure we get going again, because you should not have barriers to innovation, especially innovation that's going to improve our grid and add, add stability. I mean, when we have those blackouts, you have folks who their medicine goes bad. It's in the refrigerator, it goes bad. You've got folks who are low income, they just got their money for food stamps, their food's gone. Right? I mean, we as a society, we're paying in so many ways for this old kind of energy, this old way of relying on infrastructure, and ultimately the economy we want, the society we want. I think everyone's on point. Really, now it's just we have to move the political machinery to let us do what we want to do.
Well, and there shouldn't be any impediments from a federal level. I mean, that's the more kind of concerning element, is that's where we need the most assistance. We shouldn't have impediments from programs that are at the state and federal level. There should only be benefits to implementation. And it kind of baffles me that those big energy companies aren't investing in wind, hydroelectric, solar, and geothermal.
Right.
It's a great business opportunity. So the financial model is very easy to understand, and it's very safe investment.
Yep. I mean, it's crazy when you think about the fact these guys, they could have been the leaders. I mean, we're fighting them, but they could have embraced this. They could have been out in front. And instead, they're losing because even though they threw, hundreds of millions of dollars of political money against this stuff, the technology is so good. I mean, solar keeps improving, batteries keep improving. I mean, they chose to be on the losing side. Mm-hmm. And they had billions of dollars of capital with which they could have embraced the transition. Mm-hmm. Off the coast of the UK, they just built an offshore wind farm. And if I remember correctly, it powers 1 million homes. Now, you could just as easily be building offshore windmills instead of building offshore oil drilling sites. I mean, you can deploy your workers and your capital for the benefit of the people that that you're servicing, but they've chosen not to.
Yeah, well, the bigger, I guess, frightening thing is the disinformation action that's happening, because a lot of those companies are setting out policies that they're trying to greenwash their companies, and really they're doing nothing but the alternative. They're trying to say that they're investing in algae biofuel, and I've studied it. That's how we founded our company. Algae is not a very good, price benefit analysis type of investment. So from my perspective and my actual experience, there's alternatives that are better than that. And the real dangerous thing is that people start to believe that Shell and Exxon and all these companies are actually investing in those positive systems when they're actually still on the same track to only fossil fuel implementation.
Right. I mean, the gaming is pretty dark. I was reading an article about how Sempra is paying above market rate, or SDG&E, it's paying above market rate for solar, but it's buying it from other subsidiaries. So the same corporation is paying an inflated price for renewables because they're buying it from another subsidiary of the same corporation. And then that's going to be used to justify, well, oh, it's too expensive. Well, I mean, they're gaming it from all angles. And you brought up state versus federal. Look, a lot of folks don't realize this, but in California, we don't tax the oil coming out of the ground. In Texas, they tax the oil coming out of the ground. In Alaska, they tax the oil coming out of the ground. We should have had billions of dollars in state coffers to fund this transition, to train people, to help invest in all these kinds of new forms of energy. And so 13 times the state legislature has put this forward and it's been defeated. And people expect more out of California. I mean, they don't realize that in California, you can drill for oil next to a school. Right now, you can drill for oil next to a hospital, next to a senior center. You can't do that in Texas. You can't do that, but you can do that in California, and that's
as long as it's not in La Jolla or in
right,
Rancho
exactly,
Santa Fe.
Right. Yeah, no.
That's the unfortunate thing. I think from a big perspective, when we talked about this yesterday, is the opportunities for solar in alternative applications, like that opportunity that they did in LA to put plastic balls over their reservoir, that they ended up spending
$35 million.
$35 million, and then like a year later they pulled them all out.
Did they really?
Yeah, so I think they removed all of them. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section. But there's other alternatives where you're just putting floating solar over that reduces evaporation, and you get twice as much efficiency in your panel production. So those type of applications definitely need public-private partnerships to make work. But from a financial standpoint, you're making twice as much electricity with half the panels that you need, and you're keeping your water reservoirs fuller and not using energy to transport water around the country.
Right. Yeah, I think what a lot of folks, particularly on the right, when they don't like government spending money, they'll point to something like this. We'll say, "Why did you spend $35 million on plastic balls?" Right now, there was legitimate need. They were trying to conserve water and prevent evaporation. I think it did. I think it reduced evaporation by 20%. But if we had capital that we could deploy, where we were thinking 5 years, 7 years, 10 years out, what's the return on investment for taxpayers, right? Your idea of, well, we could have had floating solar there. Now you're taking something that was a liability and it becomes a profit center, right? So I think those are the kinds of ideas where, if you think about California as almost as its own country, right? Where we're the 5th largest economy in the world. Other governments of this scale, they have sovereign wealth funds. They deploy their capital in ways that are sensible, that achieve economic ends, but also achieve certain social objectives. And I think that's part of what's missing from the equation. The new budget from Governor Newsom, it has $250 million per year for seeding the kinds of green businesses that we're talking about. That should be way more.
Well, he's leading the way, in all honesty, on many fronts, from water, from immigration. Governor Newsom's doing a great amount of work in lots of different realms. The housing issues in Oakland and San Francisco, I know he's deployed a lot of things. So we need leadership like that, and you're absolutely right. Just put it on steroids, right? We can implement bigger programs that get that on the ground faster. Another thing too, just to make a quick plug, we have industrial partners that do floating islands. So cool. You can do floating island systems in reservoirs that actually treat all of that water.
Right.
So you're not using chemicals to treat our drinking water. You're using plants that also do the work of evaporation reduction. So, it's just a matter of common sense sometimes.
Yeah. No, we're going to have a managed transition away from fossil fuels. And we're going to, again, we fought this taxation of oil coming out of the ground has been before the legislature 13 times. It's always failed. It dies in committee. There was one time it actually got through to the governor's office and Schwarzenegger vetoed it. But where's that legislation? Why are we not using the fossil fuels to fund the transition away from fossil fuels.
Hey, why not be retroactive? Just go back and grab all of those funds that were lost, right?
Hey man, they want
it's quantified. It's on the ledger.
they want your kids to pay for it. They want my kids to pay
Right,
for it.
right.
I haven't met a single person that wants our kids to be paying $1 billion oil companies carbon debt.
I mean, a big point in that is zero in taxes, right? I mean, if everybody's not aware of that, these big major corporations pay zero in federal taxes.
There you go.
They're basically getting free money on top of free money on top of free money. So that's the first solution is fix that whole thing.
Yeah, make the polluters pay.
Right.
I think everyone's on board with that.
Well, and make them pay a fair price, right? I mean, I see an oil company having an oil spill. You should be paying 100% of the remediation plus 10% management fee. Yeah. Where did that money go when BP had their oil spill? What is it, 500 million or some odd change? It didn't go into environmental restoration. It went into their marketing campaign.
Yeah. Well, right. It goes, and not just that, it goes into the politicians that they fund. I mean, you look at these campaigns, you look at how much they spend. Spend $100 million to defeat a ballot proposition to make $1 billion. I mean, for them, this is pennies on the dollar.
Yep.
And they're going to keep doing it until we elect candidates who have the backing of the people, who are sent there with a mandate to put the public welfare, to put environment, to put economic growth first, and not support industries that are basically on their way out.
Yeah. Well, in context, we're not talking on any side of the political spectrum. It just makes financial sense that you can create a business that's self-sufficient. When you create a subsidized business, that is not a true capitalist system. We're creating a socialist system. And not to use that term because that's one of those key terms that everybody throws around, but we shouldn't be babysitting companies. They should be able to support their own ROI, right? And that's a perspective. That's why we started our company is we need to have a system that has professional project management first. They can produce those results and repeat those results. There shouldn't be a way that we're subsidized, and we don't want to be subsidized.
Right. At the end of the day, the question is, who's paying for these costs that have been externalized? And what we know is that these costs, 50 years ago, we didn't know what the impact of carbon dioxide was. We didn't know what the impact of methane was. But when we started to actually understand it, these companies, they bullied the policy into being what is favorable to them. And so they've known what the costs are. We're paying the costs. And now that they've accumulated, because carbon accumulates in the atmosphere, this is not just something that we're going to pay for our kids and their kids, and it really is threatening everything that's coming, this point forward. So we have a pivotal moment right now. I think that's what young people are waking up to, is that doing the bare minimum, sort of accommodating these industries, is not going to get us there. And the idea that they used their political and financial might to force us into this position, and now that we have the alternatives and the technology, they're still unwilling to embrace what is effectively and obviously a growth market, means that we just have to use the ballot box to take control.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just on the context of alternatives, right, we kind of mentioned the seawater type of agricultural systems. We're looking at deploying those at a larger scale right now with an industrial partner at H2O Futures, but looking at the opportunity of seawater farming and seawater landscape.
Yeah.
I mean, just in context, I planned seawater grass, or just did a financial feasibility model for Mission Bay Parks. There's 1,016 acres, and the city of San Diego spends $1 million a year. If you use seawater grass, the taxpayers are saving $1 million a year, right? You're still keeping the same jobs and still spending $1.5 million on all the maintenance of those parks, but you're easily able to transition that dollar for dollar money that we're spending on freshwater resources. We're saving the energy that it takes to move all of that water, to pour it on dirt. And we're creating an economy that is reducing the energy and freshwater usage. So you're creating a full network that reduces the overall cost to a magnitude that's probably tenfold of that.
Yeah. No, that network idea of water management is what we need. Again, this is, it's funny. We have the society where when I was in grad school, they tell you to specialize. But I think we're experiencing the limits of all that specialization, because you have to really look at all of these issues holistically and understand, stormwater, freshwater, conversion of black water, exactly. Mm-hmm. So we don't collect our stormwater in San Diego. And there was a study recently. If we collected our stormwater, we could reduce our dependency by 20% on foreign water, right? And that's and we know we're going to have bigger storms coming, and we actually have financial liabilities because we can't properly handle the flooding that happens with these storms. So, we're spending money right now when there's a big storm. We're not capturing that water. And again, this just goes back to, what's the ROI?
Yep.
And I think if you're serious about giving your kids a future, giving them a future that's going to be thriving, where you're not going to give them cities that are just racked in debt, we have to start thinking in 5, 10, 15-year intervals.
Well, yeah, on that point too is we have new policies for new buildings that is very stringent on stormwater requirements, right? Working with the city and knowing the policy side of engineering and infiltration systems, that policy is in effect for new buildings. Right? There is not a policy for retrofitting old buildings, right? Yeah. Those grants are very difficult to come by. They're cumbersome for the property owner to do. Yeah. So that's really the policy discussion at a state and federal level that gives financial incentives to those individuals that have an industrial, commercial, residential that want to add some of that new technology and infiltrate their water. Yeah. Right now, everything was built to discharge. And the infrastructure itself that collected all that was discharge. If you turn it on its head, we just need to figure out the financial mechanisms to incentivize.
Well, talk about old buildings going outside of water just to energy use. There's huge amount of opportunity with net zero energy buildings, where you're going into these older buildings that don't have double pane, triple pane windows. They don't have insulation. They've got old light bulbs. This stuff, when you package it together into a portfolio, you've got some. Swapping out old light bulbs. I mean, I think we've pretty much done that at this point, but you take things that have a 2-year return on investment, you package it in a portfolio with things that have a 9-year return on investment, and you've got real investments that investment vehicles like CalSTRS or other entities could invest in and put tens of thousands of Californians to work, reducing the energy that our buildings require. This is good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of little pieces of that, we're working on a couple industrial developments in the county, and that's a piece of the portfolio is how do we make all the glass, the roof of these structures, how do we make that solar infused?
Right.
How do we make the landscape actually seawater tolerant landscape where we have this salt accumulation in our processes that makes for the landscape. So you're continuously recycling it. But all of it is kind of a systems granular approach, but it's just a matter of how much you use it and what percentage based on the scope of work you're doing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, these kinds of things, we have to move away from like an incremental, here's a grant here, here's a grant there. We know that these things are going to pan out. Yeah. We need to deploy serious resources as a state, at a federal level as well, to really accelerate these things. I mean, we know in the business sector, not every business thrives and makes it through, but we need to get serious about investing in a portfolio of ideas. If 1 out of 5 have a major reduction in energy consumption and emissions and prove to be a viable business model, you're putting tens of thousands of people to work. Yeah. And we're likely to go into recession sometime in the near future. We should be leaning into job opportunities that are going to pay good livable wages, because if we don't do that, we're going to be paying anyway in benefits to try to help people, not fall into poverty. So again, holistic thinking, this stuff pans out.
Right, and there's a great program at the Port of San Diego. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's called the Blue Economy Incubator. So it's a program where you start a new business and you request funds from them, which is like a grant, but it's kind of them being an investor in your company, which is a very interesting platform. It would be great to see that at a city level, at a state level, at a federal level, where it's not a grant that you have to go through these arduous tasks and only the people that are very seasoned in that. I've applied for 7 grants. I haven't gotten any of them. I've gotten 6th place, which was outside of the funding bracket. And all the ones that got 1st, 2nd, and 3rd are still not built, and that was in 2012. So that's an example of the grant programs that we have right now. Just too complicated, too cumbersome, and they don't get implemented. But I think that'll wrap up our discussion on energy and policy and environmental systems for now. So thank you.
Cool.